He swept to power 3 years ago on a reputation as a strong and decisive leader, and a promise to eradicate drugs, crime, and widespread corruption in the Philippines.
The president will continue with what he has started. Still, he wants drugs. And in this country, he wants corruption also succeed, the fight against corruption.
And despite the growing outrage over his strong-arm tactics and unorthodox style of leadership, President Rodrigo Duterte remains popular among the electorate. The resounding victory of his allies in the recent midterm elections, a case in point.
You have a very popular president still based on the surveys of both Pulse Asia and SWS.
But what do the midterm elections mean for the newly empowered president? Will he be less vulnerable to political reprisals, if not legal punishment, once he steps down from power 3 years from now? Has the Philippines become more stable and prosperous in the first 3 years of his leadership? Or has he brought more misery to his own people? It was a midterm election seen as a referendum on his leadership and policies. On May 13, 2019, more than 46 million Filipinos delivered a resounding victory to allies of President Rodrigo Duterte. Backed by a record-high popularity rating of 79% heading into the elections, the president's allies swept 9 of the 12 Senate seats that were contested. That means he now has the support of 18 out of the 24 senators. Pro-Duterte candidates also managed to retain a 245-seat majority in the 297-seat House of Representatives. Among the winners were Cynthia Villar, the wife of a property developer, the Philippines' wealthiest, according to Forbes magazine; Christopher Go, Mr. Duterte's longtime personal assistant; Ronald De La Rosa, the former police chief who led the president's deadly war on drugs; and also Amy Marcos, the daughter of deposed President Ferdinand Marcos. She ran under the party of Sara Duterte, Duterte's daughter and the mayor of Davao.
It's expected but surprising in that he had a sweep of the 12 senators, and there's no even opposition. The best that the opposition could get was number 14, right? So we know all from the very start that his popularity rating is very high, and it's not normally this popularity rating is not normally translated to senatorial candidates historically. It doesn't rub off, but this one has a Duterte effect. When I look at the numbers, even the chief of police, Senator Bato, who executed his drug war, I look at the statistics in the villages where the highest number of killings occurred, and he got voted as number 3 or number 5.
Yes, at first, even though he wasn't on the electoral roll, or his daughter wasn't either, apart from running for Davao Mayor, he and his daughter were the big winners because the people that they backed won well. So 9 of the 12 positions went to Duterte supporters, 3 went to independents that may support parts of his agenda, and 0 positions went to the opposition.
The victory has not only consolidated Duterte's grip on power, it also signaled a firm approval of his policies, clearing the path for some of his most controversial plans, including the deadly war on drugs, which has killed thousands of people so far.
So I feel like at the first 3 years of his term, where the Senate wasn't as well disposed towards his agenda, The Senate was really the one that blocked some key reforms, from the death penalty to constitutional revisions to parts of the tax reform agenda. So it's likely that some of these things will move easier now that the Senate is more aligned with the president, except maybe in a year and a half, the electoral cycle for the next president will start and senators will start to position themselves. So you might have about a year window to try to push hard on some key stalled agenda items, but after that, his power will start to likely decline.
Actually, it's not true. There's opposition in the Senate, the most vocal ones, and they have the senior ones. There are probably 4 or 5 opposition, certified opposition. But the rest of the senators, they speak their own mind. They are not Duterte. They're allied with Duterte for some reasons, but they speak their own minds. For example, death penalty did not pass in the last Senate, even among Duterte's supporters. 3 or 4 cabinet members that Duterte endorsed were not endorsed by the Senate. So it's not that because these are Duterte's friends that they would always say yes to him.
Not only was the midterm election seen as a crucial referendum on Duterte's presidency, it also gave an indication of what the rest of his single term in office could look like. But what's equally shocking is that Duterte's resounding win at the polls has left the fledgling opposition in complete disarray. None of the candidates won a seat in the Senate. The last time it failed to get even one seat was in 1938. The landslide victory for the Duterte camp dealt a massive blow to the opposition, which was looking to curb the increasingly autocratic government. Opposition leader and Vice President Leni Robredo failed to convince voters with her brand of elite politics and struggled to dampen Duterte's strongman image that has spurred his popularity.
I think they had a very narrow campaign platform, which is to attack the Duterte for his foul language, attack Duterte's position on China, and attack Duterte on human rights. And people can see through the schemes of the opposition, and they see, well, look, Duterte is trying to do what he can. He's not selling out to the Chinese. He's fighting the drug war. And at the end of the day, Duterte gets an 80%, more than 80% approval rating. And the opposition realized that their attacks on Duterte has no effect. Duterte is a Teflon.
One, they didn't have a group of candidates that had much public profile apart from Mar Rojas, who came in 14th out of, so missed it by 2. So who was willing to run under the opposition were not very well known. Local politicians that are often key for organizing campaign rallies, almost all sided with the ruling administration for their own interests. And the funders, including business groups, also decided to spend their money on candidates that were aligned with the president or not spend it at all. So the opposition had 3 strikes against them and lost out.
There are other important factors. To win a national election, the Senate in particular, you need huge, immense resources, hundreds of millions. And that was one of the weaknesses of the Liberal Party, with the exception of Mar Rojas and Bam Aquino. But the others were not only relatively unknown nationally, with relatively poor national awareness, no, but they also don't have the resources to wage that kind of campaign. The use of massive government resources, for instance, no, was another factor. But we should not also discount the element of fear, especially in Mindanao, where, again, as we all know, martial law was in place. So if you combine, not to mention the fact that the legal opposition was also relatively weak because it was not cohesive.
Duterte's popularity currently stands at 80%. even as the world reacts in horror and disbelief at the murderous campaign on drug users and sellers which takes place under his watch. His policies are celebrated by some at home. Meanwhile, United Nations has approved a resolution to launch a probe into President Duterte's drug war. But the brutal crackdown on drugs has shown no signs of abating. Will Duterte be proven right at the end? Or is it a war that he just cannot win? The Philippines is an archipelago of more than 7,000 islands. Its geographic location, lengthy coastlines, and porous borders have made it an important transshipment point, especially for drug traffickers to engage in illicit trade. It's not surprising then that drug addiction has become a huge problem in the country. It's been estimated that between 1.8 million and 4 million people are drug users. President Duterte recently claimed that the number of drug users stands at a new high of 7 to 8 million people. Even before he was elected to the highest office in the Philippines, Duterte vowed to wipe out the scourge of drugs in the country. His apparent solution? Give the police unprecedented powers and total impunity to kill anyone suspected of being drug addicts or dealers. Official figures show that there were more than 120,000 anti-drug operations between July 2016 and April this year. Philippine authorities have admitted that some 6,000 people have been killed in raids and shootouts. But human rights groups put the number as high as 27,000.
Issues of security, peace and order, these are the things that are apparently very important for most Filipinos, if not all Filipinos. However, we also have to say that the frustration and desperation that we have been saying for the past decades when it comes to the right kind of governance has been twisted in the form of just allowing violence, of just allowing killings to continue just so we can have that semblance of peace and order. This is very alarming, definitely, but also very telling of how we, as a people, have resorted to desperate measures. We believe that one death is a death too many. We believe that the issue of non-accountability and impunity is one case too many. And it's something that we have been imploring this government, that do not use killing as a tool. You have to recognize that making sure that our criminal justice system is strong, that the rights of the people are protected at all times.
Among those who are still mourning over the loss of their loved ones are the family members of Kian Lloyd de los Santos. Kian was only 17 when he was fatally shot by police officers on August 16, 2017, during an anti-drug operation in Caloocan, Metro Manila. Ironically, the teenager was reportedly a supporter of Mr. Duterte's anti-drug drive. He also had a dream of becoming a police officer one day. That dream was crushed when he was found in a fetal position with gunshot wounds to his head.
Nung gabi kasi, maaga ako nagpahinga. Pagkatapos may kumatok na lang sa pintuan ko. Na sinasabi nga na si Kian nga daw ay dinampot doon sa gawin ng butika. Dinampot daw ng mga pulis. Sabi nila ng mga tao na mga kapitbahay namin. Tapos marami na nagkikwento sa amin, Kuya, nakita namin, ganyan-ganyan. Dinampot, kinaladkad ng mga pulis, pababa doon sa basketball court. Sunod-sunod yung mga patok na narinig namin. Siyempre, nung time na yon, nung napatay si Kian, graduating siya eh. Graduating siya nito sana. Nung napatay si Kia, ilang buwan gagraduate. Kasi exam nila yun eh. Nung gabi. Kaya nga nung sinasabi niyong mga nakarinig nung huling sandali, nung nagmamakaawa siya dun sa pulis eh. Sir, tama na po. May exam pa po ako bukas. Daming nakarinig.
The police claimed that the grade 11 student was not on their drug watch list, but had been placed under suspicion based on the testimony of a detained suspect. But Kian's friends and family have claimed otherwise. CCTV footage and witness accounts show two men in civilian clothes dragging a boy across a basketball court before he was killed, execution style.
It's a case of rogue policeman. Then they have to be investigated, prosecuted, and so on. Of course, nothing is happening there, right? But if it is a matter of public policy, then we have a problem. Right? If that is a policy, then we have a problem.
So I think if you look at the beginnings of, we're 3 years into a war on drugs, he says at his State of the Nation address a couple of weeks ago will continue. But in the first year and a half or 2 years, the death tolls, including the extrajudicial killings, were at a much higher level than we've seen for the last year. So there still are people dying in the war on drugs, including in very questionable manners, but at a much lower level. So I think they've already changed their approach to the war on drugs to make it less politically costly. Because the only time he fell in opinion polls to a moderate level of support rather than an extremely high one was after the killing of a teenager that became a major media story. So after that, I think they toned down the war on drugs, not stopped it, but toned it down.
Earlier this year, the Philippines officially quit the International Criminal Court after the tribunal began a preliminary examination into the controversial drug war. But as the death toll rises, public outrage over the killings has also intensified. The anger over Kian's death finally led to the investigation of the police officers involved. In a stunning move, President Duterte also called for a probe into the case, saying that those responsible would be brought to justice. But this hasn't silenced critics of Duterte's deadly drug war. The international community is calling for an investigation into the killings and has asked Duterte's government to bring culprits to justice. In July, Amnesty International accused Duterte of carrying out a large-scale murdering enterprise. The human rights group is also urging the United Nations to investigate the Philippine president for crimes against humanity. Duterte's critics say that the campaign to rid drugs from the Philippines has failed spectacularly.
When you say a drug war, you are in effect saying that the main resources to be used would be force and violence. No? But we already know, not just from our past experience, but even from the comparative experiences of many of our neighbors and countries all over the world that have faced the same problem. You don't resolve the drug problem that way, no?
We don't condone any irregularities on the part of our anti-illegal drug operatives to go beyond the boundaries, go beyond the law, or something that's violative of our police operational procedures, which uphold human rights and the rule of law. So even without any complaint, we are investigating our people. In fact, we have already dismissed something like 459 police personnel who were involved in illegal drug operation, or those found to be positive for illegal drugs use.
And while the drug war rages on and the bodies continue to pile up, a record 33 per day, according to some reports, the real question remains. Has Duterte's hardline approach helped eradicate the drug problem in the country?
The retail side, the retail operations of the drug war probably will not succeed. And probably Duterte has realized that there's 4 million, you cannot exterminate them all, right? You can kill everybody, but people will still be hooked. So I think he realized that, and now he's trying to go after the bigger fish. But the problem is that corrupt people in the Bureau of Customs, corrupt people in the police and the judiciary are still allowing the importation of wholesale of ice in the Philippines. And there were quite a few incidents where tons of ice were imported to the Philippines and they got into the market. So you can do your retail killing. The problem will not be solved as long as this wholesale importation of drugs, as long as you don't solve the problem in the police and in the Bureau of Customs, which is quite difficult because Philippines has 7,000 islands and these drugs are just floating in the sea.
In spite of international criticism against Duterte's violent war on drugs, the president has resisted calls to end the brutal crackdown. If anything, he's promised to step up the drug war, stressing that the war on drugs would be even bloodier during his last 3 years in office. He also pressed lawmakers to reinstate the death penalty for serious drug-related crimes.
I think of all of the things that he came to power saying he was going to do, changing the constitution, coming up with peace deals with the communists, the war on drugs has been the one that he has focused on the most. Each of his 4 State of the Nation addresses first starts with a justification for the war on drugs. So first for him, it's clearly a crusade that he sees as a long-term one. And so I think he really believes in the war on drugs and what he hopes to get out of it as well. It's also a way of showing people that he's doing something.
While the drug war marks a controversial chapter in his presidency, Duterte has done pretty well on the economic front. Reports say that the Philippine economy is set to grow by 6.4% this year, the same as last year. The growth has been attributed to the robust spending under the infrastructure development program called Build, Build, Build. Under this initiative, the government will put $180 billion into at least 75 flagship infrastructure projects over a decade.
But that is precisely why he has engaged the Chinese government in friendly trade relations, so that we can get as many benefits economically from this government as well as other countries. We're doing that. Our economic managers are very competent. And if you notice, the issue on inflation has been solved.
There were a few grants here and there. They gave money to Marawi. They gave 1 or 2 bridge, some training here and there. But some of the big ticket projects like the railway in Mindanao that has yet to happen. There's a lot of pipeline projects going on, dams and so on. So it will take time. I think people should be patient. The relationship with China is not less than 3 years old. It's not more than 3 years old. So people should not just completely say that, oh, it's already 3 years old and you've not gotten anything from China. That's not fair to say.
From about 2010 onwards, the Philippines has been one of the strongest economies in East Asia. So I think that shows that there is quite a bit of momentum, and the market fundamentals are very good. The Philippines' demographic position is very good, a young workforce coming in, the middle class is starting to expand and having consumption power, and the macroeconomic settings from interest rates to the budget are all positive and have remained positive under President Duterte.
Duterte is halfway through his term. The Philippines Constitution stipulates that the president can stay in office for a maximum of 6 years. In other words, he can only serve for a one-term limit and is not eligible for re-election. That means Duterte's tenure in office will come to an end 3 years from now. But will the brutal and deadly operations on drugs mar his presidency? And will these acts come back to haunt him soon after he steps down from office? International condemnation has done little to dent his popularity. The opposition challenge has failed to loosen his firm grip on power. If anything, criticism and challenges have made the firebrand and controversial leader a lot stronger and even more determined to achieve his goals. Coupled with an encouraging economic record at home, Rodrigo Duterte has been able to validate his image as a decisive and effective leader in the eyes of ordinary Filipinos.
So if you look at his level of popularity, he is an extremely successful retail politician in terms of sustained levels of popularity and ability to get his candidates elected in the midterm elections.
84% satisfaction rating, 3% disapproval rating. Where on earth can you find a president with a 3% dissatisfaction rating on the middle of his term?
For now, President Rodrigo Duterte appears to be invincible. There's not a single opposition voice strong enough to challenge him. But what will happen 3 years from now? Will his words and actions come back to haunt him once he leaves office? Recent history doesn't bode well for Duterte's future. Past presidents have faced the threat of criminal investigations for perceived misdeeds after leaving office. For example, former President Joseph Estrada, or ERAP, was sentenced to life in prison in September 2007 after he was found guilty of corruption. He was granted clemency from his successor and former deputy Gloria Arroyo. In November 2011, former President Gloria Arroyo herself was arrested on allegations of electoral fraud. She faced 40 years in prison upon conviction. The court, however, dismissed the charges against her during Duterte's presidency.
If we look at the history of former presidents, the cases come after the president leaves office. So for instance, GMA, the cases came after her term. Of course, the case of ERAP, even President Noynoy, the case of Deng Vaxia. So it's natural that after the president ends his term, many of his actions and the actions of his people will be subjected to a lot of investigations.
Maybe the UN might try to chase him, but depending on who's the next president, if his daughter is the next president, okay, why they wouldn't allow that. If the opposition wins, it will be a process. I don't think they can simply just go and arrest him after he steps down. It's a long process, and China has veto powers. He's got other friends and all the stuff. Duterte is 72. Would he care to think what would happen to the UN process after he steps down?
So if you look at the last 3 presidents who have left office in the Philippines, they're under their successor, they have faced criminal charges, starting with Joseph Estrada, then Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, and now Benigno Aquino. So it really depends on who takes over or who succeeds him. If it is his daughter, who is a leading candidate, then he may very well be protected. But if it's somebody who isn't personally aligned with Duterte, he clearly has taken actions as a president that could be the basis for at least investigation after. So he's in a dangerous post-presidential position depending on who succeeds him.
So will the same thing happen to President Duterte after he leaves office, given the accusations about his human rights records?
In the history of presidents, this is the first time that we are faced with that kind of inquiry.
Some analysts think the midterm elections in May this year not only helped Duterte solidify his position, but also gave him the opportunity to find a suitable successor who will replace him, continue his legacy, protect his interests, and cushion him against the fate of his predecessors.
Every president wants to have a safe candidate after them. So I wouldn't be surprised that Duterte's daughter, Mayor Inday Sara, might want to try her hat 3 years from now. Why not? She's popular. She might inherit the Duterte legacy or Duterte magic in Mindanao in some regions, but that would still very much depend on who is the other candidate and how much money would both sides have, because this is how Philippine politics works.
I think part of the reason, if not the main reason, is the President President Duterte wants to avoid accountability for what he did while in office. And the only way he can guarantee avoidance of that accountability is by having a friend or a member of the family to succeed him.
So if the tide turns against Duterte, who will come to his rescue? The formidable contender who has emerged is his longtime aide and loyalist turned senator, Bongo. Many observers see him as an extension of Duterte's presidency. He has openly backed the president's war against crimes, corruption and illegal drugs. He also supports a bill to reimpose the death penalty for heinous crimes and drug trafficking.
It depends on who he will be up against. If it's against, I don't think Mayor Inday will be fighting with Senator Bongo. There are other candidates. The young mayor of Metro Manila is making waves. Senator Grace Poe, who has won topped the Senate in the last few years and is still quite popular. She might make it a run again. Senator Cynthia Villar has the capital and she was #1 in the Senate, might want to try. So it will be a tight-cornered fight. And in this situation, I don't think Bongo would want to throw his hat because all the candidates are women.
I think that's quite unlikely because, again, Bongo became senator because he seemed to be the right-hand man and fixer for the president. So that's his political role. It's kind of hard to see how that could be translated above Sara Duterte, for example, to that. So I think that's unlikely. Manny Pacquiao may be a more likely presidential candidate from Mindanao.
Sara Duterte, known as Inday Sara to the Philippine public, has been the mayor of Davao City since 2010, after her father's tenure reached its term limit. Her political career has allowed her to build a public presence. As a result, Sara Duterte has been able to build a stature similar to her father's.
There are people who say that Mayor Sara is very different from President Duterte, either for the good or for the better. Of course, she may be considered more hard-headed.
She appears to be projecting the same political image as the father, President Duterte, no? Decisive. It's that decisiveness of a leader that may be the crucial factor ultimately, no? Because in the same manner that President Duterte was able to capitalize on that, no? Who knows that might still resonate with the electorate come 2022.
Davao's transformation from the murder capital of the Philippines to the second fastest growing economic region is closely tied to the leadership of the Duterte family, including Inday Sara.
So interesting, if you look at why, especially at the national level, her national political profile, including even in the last midterm elections where she led the senatorial campaign for the ruling slate, it's really tied to being the daughter of the president. So she is mayor of the second largest city. But at the national level, her political persona is very tied to that of her father. It'll be interesting if voters come 2022 see that as enough reason to vote for her compared to other politicians like Cynthia Villar, who by herself has a national political profile. She was the top vote winner in the senatorial midterm elections.
Political families have established strongholds of support across 8 major regions of the Philippines. And 5 of these dynasties have unified under Sara's coalition of political parties, Hukbong ng Pagbabago. And as she consolidates the support of these influential families, the clamour for her to succeed her father in Malacanang grows.
Her major role was basically in strengthening, putting together a broader coalition of very powerful political families, you know. Almost all the major political families, from the Marcoses to the Villars to the other major political families, including the Stradas, became part of that broader coalition. Yes. No?
Given that we have very weak political parties and we have a very personalistic politics in the Philippines, it's natural that the children of the politicians, particularly a popular president, may decide to run. As long as the president will maintain his popularity until the end of his term, it's possible that Mayor Sara will be one of the possible candidates for 2022. There's that Duterte magic, but that depends also, of course, on the success and continued popularity of President Duterte.
I think he will be the next president of the Philippines. There is no person in the political horizon that can match her popularity and her qualities. I think she has the same qualities with his president father.
However, the so-called Duterte magic relies on the will of the people. And while there may be overwhelming support behind Mr. Duterte right now, it's not quite certain where the political pendulum might swing once he leaves office. Will the president continue to strengthen the positions of his loyalists and his family members to help safeguard his interests and future? Or does he have other plans in mind? It's halfway into Duterte's presidential term, but his aura of invincibility remains intact. He recently received a big boost following the massive victory of his allies in the midterm elections. The election also saw his allies winning the majority of seats in the Senate. And just last month, his approval ratings reached a new high of 80%. Unlike in 2001, when the second People Power Revolution brought down the leadership of former President Joseph Estrada for alleged corruption, people have not come out to the streets to oppose the rule of President Duterte. In fact, according to a survey by Pulse Asia recently, 8 out of 10 Filipinos still trust him and approve of his performance.
I think people see, what you see is what you get. And people has gotten used to his foul mouth and foul language and all his sexist jokes, misogynistic jokes, so on and so forth. But I think people can see Duterte as the president. So you take governance seriously. For everything else, you take it lightly.
The president has for a while been fixated on his next big project, constitutional change. In December last year, the House of Representatives approved various amendments to the Constitution that would move the Philippines towards a federal form of government from the current unitary government.
As a former mayor in Davao City, you see 2/3 of the country's GDP is concentrated in Metro Manila and the next 2 regions beside Metro Manila. 2/3. More than 80% of the national public expenditure is controlled by the national government. 90% of total revenues are controlled and obtained by the national government. So these numbers alone would make the case that you are too concentrated because it's an American presidential system with Imperial Manila at the center.
So I think particularly he's the first president from Mindanao. Mindanao is the second largest island with about 25% of the population. That's the furthest away from Manila, is the poorest island by far, and the most that feels that it's being ignored under the current heavily centralized system. So Mindanao politicians have long advocated, been the strongest advocates for federalism, to try to bring more power to the regions, including Mindanao, and less from in Manila.
Federalism is a system that attempts to amalgamate or put together these fragmented local government units to work together so that they will not only cooperate but will forge relationships that will allow them to work as if they were one political unit. When we push for federalism, we are further empowering local government units in a sense that they are not only giving them more political power. You're giving them the resources. You're giving them the right venue for them to actually use their power. Because even if you give so much power, but the jurisdiction is quite limited, it would not mean anything at all.
Critics of President Duterte, however, claim that the idea of constitutional change is nothing more than a thinly veiled attempt to extend the president's term in office beyond 2022.
Because he does at the moment have a single 6-year term, yes. And there was quite a bit of speculation that one of the goals was to have a second term. Many leaders find ways of extending, changing the Constitution to extend their term. I think and when Duterte said that's not what he wants to do and pushed, when there was a draft federal constitution, he pushed for a new clause to say that the serving president could not run for another term. So I think he's probably honest there.
Other observers also reject that possibility, insisting that President Duterte is not interested in extending his rule beyond his current 6-year term in office.
I don't see a scenario where he will himself personally aim for another term. No?
Right.
I think physically and health-wise, it appears that he has disqualified himself for this prospect.
The president categorically said he doesn't want anything to do with the new government in place.
He doesn't even want to stay there. He has threatened to resign 3 times already because of frustration. He doesn't want to run this country anymore. Actually, it's just costing along, because that is the term of office that the Filipino people have given him.
Surveys taken last year also show that 2 out of 3 Filipinos oppose any move for a constitutional amendment. The 1987 Constitution, which came into effect after the ouster of Philippine dictator Ferdinand Marcos, limits the presidential tenure to a single fixed 6-year term without possibility of re-election.
So when you ask people, what do you want the government to focus on, changing the Constitution, not federalism, just changing the Constitution, gets about 1% support, whereas jobs will get 40%. The second, I think rightfully so, many Philippine voters don't trust their politicians to change the Constitution in ways that will benefit anybody but themselves.
But if the Federalist Charter is approved, the 6-year term of President Rodrigo Duterte may be extended. And that can happen during the country's transition period to a federal system. It would also grant sweeping powers to the president, which was once granted to Philippines' former dictator, Ferdinand Marcos.
Assuming that the Federalist Charter is approved, there is a transition period where, in effect, the president assumes virtually all the significant powers of government. He will be empowered to reorganize, in effect, the entire machinery of government. No?
What Duterte signaled after the State of the Nation address is that he wants the House and the Senate first to discuss among themselves all the details, and then they present it as a package. So I cannot make any conclusions now on whether the transitory provision could be abused or not.
Yeah, so the draft constitution that came out from, federal constitution that came out from the Presidential Commission is kind of unclear on the limits to these extraordinary powers. And there was also a problem not only that during this transition period that's pretty much executive rule, for that transition to end, they have to pass certain legislation. If that legislation isn't passed, then that term could extend beyond the original projected term. But I think the chances for constitutional reform, particularly major constitutional reform, are starting to look pretty dim because we're halfway through the 6-year term and we're still basically on square one.
With the growing skepticism over the shift to a federal form of government, the chances of constitutional change being passed appear to be slim, at least for now. The next best alternative for President Duterte is to build his own alliances with those in the government to help ensure organic support for himself and his agenda until his term ends and beyond.
There are pending cases already filed in the International Criminal Court, but again, we know the realities of international relations. Normally, nothing really can be done, no? As long as the sitting president commands enough resources, especially political and military resources, no, to fend off any kind of challenge from the ICC. But we also know that once the incumbent presidency loses his or her power, that makes himself or herself more vulnerable to prosecution by the ICC, of course. And we've already seen concrete cases of former leaders being actually arrested and tried by the ICC, no? Leaders notably in the former Yugoslavia, Slobodan Milosevic in particular, no? And some African leaders who have been indicted for crimes against humanity, for instance. You know, of course, that is a possibility once he is no longer the incumbent president. No?
It remains unclear what Duterte's next move on constitutional change will be, or whether he will distance himself from divisive and destructive policies such as the highly controversial drug war. What is clear is that he will continue with his plans to provide Filipinos with a more comfortable life during the remaining 3 years of his administration.